Alrighty, this is an audio review of chapter 5. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about what distinguishes positivistic perspectives from the classical or rational choice perspectives that we've already gone over. We're going to talk about the early pre-Darwinian theories that are just wild, right? Like craniology, phrenology, stuff like that. And then the later also messed up Darwinian theories like Lombroso's theories. And then we're going to look at some of the key assumptions, propositions, and weaknesses of Lombroso's theories of atavism and the born criminal. Talk about IQ stuff and how that was wildly used. And then Sheldon's body type theories, also strange. Okay, so starting off with the early biological theories of behavior. Academics and scientists were noticing that deterrence framework wasn't explaining the distribution of crime, and this led them to new explanations for why crime was happening or why people behaved as they do. And most of these focused on the fact that certain groups tended to offend more than others, and that those groups must just be, quote unquote, inferior and should be controlled or even eliminated. Not subtle, very racist, as we'll talk about, because all of this is circling back to a general stance towards eugenics. This was the study and policies related to the improvement of the human race via the control over selective reproduction. The idea being that only people with good genes should have babies. People who are stupid or morally problematic or, of inferior stock or breed should not have children. And so this kind of always reminds me of that thing when people are like, if I had a time machine, I'd go back and kill baby Hitler or whatever, which is always weird that it's always baby Hitler. It's not like adolescent Hitler. But anyway, my whole argument to that is like, good for you, I guess. But it's just that unless you could change the whole Western world's notion of eugenics, then killing Hitler might not have been enough. Because the entire Western world accepted the idea of eugenics. It was considered science. Like, this is how messed up and racist it was. And this is also when people talk about racism being embedded within our social systems. You're going to see the ways in which these eugenic ideas built their way into certain systems and had huge impacts, whether it was sterilizing people so they could never have children again, or, things like being deported or being put in prison. So anyway, in the early to mid 1800s, lots of perspectives regarding crime and how people behave were really looking at it from this eugenicist viewpoint. And so they thought if we could just figure out who's superior, who's inferior, then we can figure out who's committing crimes and who's not, right? And hint, the people who were doing the research always seem to find themselves superior. Isn't that interesting? Anyway, let's move on. So here's one of the wild ones. Craniometry. This was the belief that the size of the brain or skull represented the superiority or inferiority of certain individuals or ethnic or racial groups. So, although modern science has dismissed this, obviously, it's all about, saying that there's a correlation between, the size of the skull and the size of the brain, which is true. But craniometry is saying, like, the shape of it is what makes someone smart or not, which there's so much bias. Anyway, it's hard to even get there. All right, different ways to measure it. These are fun. Sometimes they would just measure people's skulls. That makes sense, right? But then they just take people who were dead, or recently dead, and, take out their brain and, like, weigh it, or just, look at the volume of their brain. And then they looked at people who had died long before, and they would just pour stuff into their empty skull and then measure that. So, and scientists eventually realized that those seeds they were using were not a valid measure of volume, so they started using ball bearings. And you're like, nope, still isn't the problem. The problem is measuring the inside of someone's skull. Largely because, again, not every part of the inside of it is filled with your brain. You got a little goo in between, right? But it's really more about their idea that they're trying to find some essentialized difference between different groups of people and say that it's biologically inherent and therefore one group is superior and one group's inferior, and they just can't do that. So most studies by craniometrists showed subjects that were white, Western, European as being superior because of the, the balance of the genu to the splenium, right? The front portion of the brain, the genu, is thought to be larger in superior people, and the hind portion of the splenium was predicted to be larger in lesser individuals or groups. But they knew exactly what they were doing. This is so unethical and not real methodology, because they would just basically take a skull, already knowing what the racial or ethnic group was, be like, here's the superior groups, here's the inferior groups, based on their social dynamics of the time period, and then just say, well, this one's better than the other. They're not saying why. They're just like, well, because it's European. That's basically what they're saying. So obviously it's like barely even science, right? So the examinations were largely done with the intent of furthering the assumptions of eugenics and trying to prove eugenics as a science, that there was a, racial superiority science, which they couldn't do because there's not. So studies done without knowing which skulls or brains were from which ethnic group showed only a small correlation between size and certain behaviors or personalities. So basically their whole presumption only works if they already know how to bias it. So yeah, obviously not really science. Okay, moving on. Phrenology, similar. But they thought that human dispositions were based on distinctions in the skull, which are believed to conform to the shape of the brain. So like, for instance, I don't know if any of you have ever had your head shaved and you find out, oh, I got a weird bump on part of my head. They would say, oh, you got that weird bump on part of your brain too. Because they assumed any bump or abnormality on the skull was related to your brain in that same spot, which is not true. But again, the whole point of phrenology still was trying to support the assumptions of eugenics and say some people are superior, some people are inferior. Again, they couldn't do that because that's not science. Anyway, phrenology did get one thing right, so gold star for them. They did think that different parts of the brain were responsible for different things, and that's true. But they're wrong about everything else. Okay, physiognomy. This was a weird one too. This is the study of facial and other bodily aspects in order to indicate developmental problems such as criminality. Right? You got a weird face, you must be a criminal, right? So early studies focused on contrasting various racial or ethnic groups. So it's just racism. We're just taking racism and we're institutionalizing racism and inequality by saying, hey, these groups are good, they don't commit crimes, which of course they do. And this group is bad and they commit all the crimes, which of course is not true. So anyway, when looking at this stuff, the early studies were looking at that, and then of course the origins of this really come from Darwin and his influence, The Origin of the Species, which provided a vague framework that proposed that humans had evolved from more primitive beings and that human species, like all other species, were evolving and adapting to preferred, adapting through a process that he called natural selection. So this made a huge impact on societal viewpoints in regarding the rank order of groups in society, and laid the groundwork for what would become the first major scientific theory of crime, if you can call it that, Lombroso's theory of the born criminal. Okay, so Lombroso, this guy, he basically came up with this concept. It's really considered the first attempt towards a scientific theory in criminological thought in his book, Criminal Man, 1876. He basically brought together pre-Darwinian theories of craniometry, phrenology, and physiognomy, and largely based on certain groups or individuals being what he called atavistic, or likely to be born to commit crime. So an atavistic person is a person or a feature of a person that's a throwback to an earlier stage of evolutionary development. It's actually funny. I remember the first time I ever learned about atavism, I immediately thought of one of my friends from high school, that he's this dude, kind of like macho-y bro dude. But he's got like a big ass forehead. He's got like that Neanderthal forehead, right? And so the idea would be, okay, you just look at a guy, he's got a big old forehead, then he must be not evolved completely, right? Or in other words, the idea is that people who are serious criminals are manifestations of lower forms of evolution. They haven't evolved enough. So Lombroso would suggest that chronic offenders are more like that missing link, right, between humans and our primate ancestors. So he also did say, okay, there's other types of offenders as well. There's the mentally ill, or the criminaloids, as he called them, who committed minor offenses due to external or environmental circumstances, aka poverty. Sometimes means you gotta steal to eat. He also claimed that the born criminals were the ones who should be the ones that we're focusing on, right? We should really look at them to try and deal with crime, deal with the born criminals, and we can really deal with crime. And most criminologists now do not call them born criminals. They refer to them as chronic offenders, right? Okay, so basically, Lombroso claimed that born criminals can't be stopped for their natural tendencies to be antisocial. And the idea is that, Lombroso also claimed, though, that born criminals are inevitable. Like, they're just going to commit crimes, right? There's no way the society can prevent that or reduce that. They're just bad. And he said, hey, you can actually identify who these people are by this thing called stigmata. And I'm not talking about the thing where, like, you believe in Jesus so much your hands start bleeding, right? Which is totally a thing. This stigmata is a physical manifestation of atavism of an individual, with such physical features being indications of prior evolutionary stages of development. So basically, like, you got a weird forehead like that dude I went to high school with, you must be a Neanderthal. So there's a list of stigmata he had. He said if you have more than 5 stigmata, you're atavistic. You're going to be a criminal. So what were these stigmata? Well, here's the best one for science. They just changed. Yeah, that's not how science works, right? But they mostly consisted of facial or bodily features that deviated from some sort of perceived norm, aka European norm. So this could be someone with a big nose or a small nose, a big jaw or a large jaw, small jaw, big ears, small ears, big eyes, small eyes. Anything that was outside of the kind of bell curve of what was considered normal for physical development in human beings. And again, human beings there meaning mostly predominantly like what's normal for Europeans. He also threw in some random stuff like if you have tattoos or epilepsy. It's a random one. Also, he said you could identify the stigmata of certain types of criminals. So basically, he could look at someone and be like, you're an arsonist. You're a murderer. You like to shoplift because look at your nose. So Lombroso was connected to the assumptions of positivism, which is synonymous with the term determinism, which is the assumption that most of human behavior is determined by factors beyond free will and free choice. So the positive school is based on the fundamental prediction that factors outside of free will or choice, such as biological, psychological, sociological variables, determine the choices we make regarding all types of behavior, especially decisions of whether or not to engage in criminal activity. So some of the policy implications that came from Lombroso's, beliefs, let's call it, was he was actually called in to testify in many criminal processes and trials to determine the guilt or innocence of suspects. Because remember, he could look at someone's face and be like, that's an arsonist. So normally this might include identifying which suspect, often out of many, had committed a crime. So they're doing a lineup, but instead of the victim picking it out, it's this guy because he's like, well, look at that guy's jaw. He's weird. Another policy implication was in some parts of the world, they would identify young children on the basis of observed stigmata, which tend to be noticeable in the first 5 to 10 years of life, and track those individuals. Modern medicine has supported the identification, documentation, and tracking of certain high-risk developmental problems or features that result in or basically that hint towards those developmental problems, such as head circumference out of a normal range, or malformed ears, low set ears, big gaps between the first and second toes, webbing in toes. Actually, I went to high school with a girl, I just keep bringing up high school for some reason, that she had webbed toes, and she was a total star in water polo. So, it's not the end of the world if you have webbed toes. No earlobes, that's weird. Curved fifth fingers, asymmetrical ears, furrowed tongue, simian creases, things like that. The idea being that you would track them to hopefully support, any sort of developmental problems they might then face later in life. All right, so moving on to the IQ testing era. This is after Lombroso. Theorists and researchers were not ready to give up on eugenics just yet. They still knew for a fact that they were racially superior, right? Of course they weren't, but they're dumb and their bias affected their research. So this is something we'll come back to time and time again in sociology. The belief systems of the time period affect the way you can develop theories or way you can see the world, right? For instance, in that first chapter, when we talked about how people thought, oh, well, the devil's in you, so I have to crack your skull open to get the devil out, and that's how I solve crime, right? the ideology of the time period affected that. So now we're talking about the time period where, because there's so much, racial animus in society, that affected the way people could understand these actual things in their lives. So anyway, Binet, okay, this is the dude who originally created the IQ score, and he created this in France for youth to identify who wasn't performing up to par, so that they could give them tutoring or other interventions, and their IQ could explicitly be changed, meaning, if you could find a slow learner, you could then train them and increase their IQ. That was the whole point of why he did this, right? Instead, this guy named Goddard came in the US and decided, no, IQ is something that stays the same forever. It's static. It's innate. It does not change, which he's wrong. And he used this for the purposes of deporting people, incapacitating people, like meaning putting them in jail, sterilizing people, taking away their ability to have children, and otherwise ridding society of low IQ individuals. So the idea here is that intelligence is passed from generation to generation. And so someone who's labeled as low IQ has feeble-mindedness. And if you want to fix the gene pool, the eugenic gene pool for future generations, then you want to weed out people who are not smart, basically. So here's a fun fact. There's an actual order from best to lowest intelligence, and I guarantee these are words you've used in your life not knowing that they're actually supposed to be kind of scientific terms for how stupid a person is. So from highest to lowest intelligence, you have morons, then imbeciles, and then lastly, idiots. So from a eugenicist point of view, the biggest threat to the progress of humanity is not the idiots. It's actually the morons. Because a moron is smart enough to slip through the cracks and reproduce, which creates the biggest threat to humanity. So, the Homer Simpsons, I guess, right? The ones that are dumb, but somehow they can still get the Marge and have some kids, and therefore the whole gene pool suffers. So Goddard was very proud that he got a lot of people deported. And he enthusiastically reported that deportations for the reason of mental deficiency increased by 350% in 1913 and 570% in 1914 over the average of the preceding 5 years before that. Oh, Goddard. Over time, he realized that his policy recommendations of deportation, incarceration, and sterilization were not actually based on accurate science, which Binet could have told him, because that's the dude who invented the IQ test in the first place and literally said your IQ changes and can change over time. So anyway, he eventually realized, oh, that's not actually accurate, right? So After consistently validating his IQ test on immigrants and mental patients, he finally tested the IQ scale on a relatively representative cross-section of American citizens, specifically people who were drafted for military service during World War I. And the results showed that many of the recruits would score as feeble-minded on the IQ test. You're like, hey, you going to deport them or are you going to put them in the war? So Goddard changed, and by change I mean lowered, the score or the criteria for what determined a person as feeble-minded. Instead of it being someone with the intelligence of a 12-year-old, it became someone that had the mental age of an 8-year-old. And then, of course, towards the end of his career, he admitted that the intelligence could be improved, right? You could actually increase your IQ, despite his earlier assumption that it was innate and static. And I'm sure all those people that were in prison because he said that their IQ couldn't change, and all those people that were taken away their ability to have children because their IQ couldn't change, I'm sure they totally got it. Oh, he just made a mistake, no problem. Right? So again, despite his admission, sterilization is a whole nother part of this. So, he's like, okay, just kidding. People's IQ can change. Specifically the US and other countries used sterilization of individuals, most specifically females, as a way to kind of deal with crime or potential future crime or things like this. The assumption, again, being that if you are low IQ, that your kids will be low IQ, and that, again, if you're a criminal, that your kids will be a criminal. So this was kind of brought all the way up to the Supreme Court in the case of Buck v. Bell in 1927, which discussed the issue of sterilizing individuals who had scored or whose parents had scored as mentally deficient on intelligence scales. And again, this isn't taking into account, do they speak English or write in English? Have they been given any formal education? Are we talking about rural people in the middle of nowhere that don't have any formalized education? And then being like, they're feeble-minded, right? And you're like, well, no. So, the court upheld the idea that you could use sterilization for the purpose of limiting reproduction among people who were deemed as feeble-minded according to a test score. So sterilizations continued for many, many years, because that was the 20s. They continued through the 1970s when the process was quote-unquote finally halted, though in fairness, there have been a lot of court cases in regards to forced sterilizations happening to women in prisons, especially women of color or Latinx women, being once they give birth in prison, often having their tubes tied without their consent, things of this nature. The assumption being, well, if you're in jail, you're a criminal, your kid's going to be a criminal too, which is not how the whole justice system's supposed to work. The whole idea of rehabilitation is that, like, you've paid your debts to society, now you can move on. But again, people aren't given that real opportunity often in these situations, especially when you just basically take away someone's right to have a child or not. Because you've just deemed no, this IQ test says you can't. So once you get to Hershey and Hindelang, they kind of doubled back to this in the 1970s, and we're really looking at intelligence and its effect on youth. And they found that among youth in the same race or social class, intelligence has a significant effect on delinquency and criminality. And so they pointed out that the IQs of delinquents or criminals are approximately 10 points lower than those of non-criminals. Though recent studies have shown that certain types of intelligence are much more important than others, meaning low verbal intelligence has the most significant impact on predicting delinquent and criminal behavior. There's types of intelligence like social intelligence, being able to talk to people, right? They call it, book smarts, street smarts, different kinds of intelligence. What's interesting about this too is I just want to point out a little caveat here. Remember that dark figure of crime we talked about before. We're only basing this off of the people who are caught. So maybe some criminals really are very smart because they're the ones who aren't caught. Maybe those who are getting caught or being delinquent are, again, have lower IQs potentially, at least in the research that they found in the 1970s. But yeah, all I'm saying is that's not the entire picture. Okay, Sheldon's model of somatyping, this merged the concepts of biology and psychology and claimed that the embryonic and fetal stages of development, that in that time period people tend to have an emphasis on the development of certain tissue layers. And these varying degrees of emphasis are largely due to heredity, which, leads to the development of certain kinds of body types. And the idea is your body type affects your personality. Right? So all embryos must develop 3 distinct tissue layers. The first is the endoderm, which is the inner layer of tissues, includes internal organs. Then you have the mesoderm, which is the muscles, bones, and ligaments and tendons. And then the ectoderm is the outer layer of tissue, like the skin, capillaries, and nervous system sensors. So basically, Sheldon's taking this idea and connecting it to different body types, saying that there's 3 different kinds of body types. There's endomorphic people, obese people. There's mesomorphic, those, healthy athlete, CrossFit people. And then there's the thin, skinny ectomorphs. And so Sheldon and his research team would grade subjects on 3 dimensions, respective to the body type scale. And they basically would indicate whether, a person was one of these 3 body types. And according to the theory, the hypothetical subject would be a likelier candidate for crime if they were a mesomorph. So each body type was measured on a scale of 1 to 7, 7 being the highest, and each somatype had the following kind of order: endomorphy, mesomorphy, ectomorphy. So basically he's saying there's personality traits or temperaments connected to your body type. So these personality traits could be like, for visceronic, this means an endomorphic person is, the idea is endomorphic person, an obese person, is going to be jolly, right? Like Kris Kringle or something. Or lazy, right? Because of their body. Somatytonic is the idea that a mesomorphic person is going to be a risk taker and more aggressive because they got all those muscles, right? They're going to be hopping those fences and breaking stuff and punching people and stuff like that. And then the cerebrotonic is this idea that the skinny little introverted ectomorph is going to be like real shy and with behind their glasses and on the computer, using their brain, right? Hence the cerebrotonic, right? So his whole argument was that mesomorphs have the highest propensity towards criminality due to their dispositions towards risk-taking and aggressive personalities. But I think probably the most interesting fun fact about this whole Sheldon's model of somatyping is how the research was actually conducted. Again, I'm a nerd for the research, but it's pretty wild. So what they would do is they would take pictures of freshmen at Ivy League schools, especially schools like Harvard, and they were told that it was for like medical reasons that they had to take these pictures. They would take 3 pictures of each guy, and because it was guys at the time, it was gender segregated. But anyway, Ivy League schools. So they would take pictures of these guys naked and say, this is for medicine, when it was really used for this particular research study. And a fun fact about that is that involves current and recently past politicians who were those freshmen at Harvard. I mean, not that you'd want to see that. But anyway, so the methodology used was just wild. He just based it off of looking at 3 pictures of a person. And, again, this kind of assumption that the link between mesomorphy and criminality, it's more about, that there's really a debate as to whether or not there's an actual link there. Okay, and last up, policy implications. So you could propose more medical screening at birth and in early childhood regarding people that have minor physical anomalies, if you believe in some of that stuff. Like I said before, those minor anomalies are a red flag signal, or the MPAs, that they already use that for, especially things that could have impacts on cognitive abilities. Another one they talked about was having same-sex classes for children in school, because they focus on deficiencies that have been shown for both young boys and girls. Meaning, if we have a gender bias in the classroom in the way that we then implement, studies or just the way in which we treat children in the classroom, then actually having those kind of segregated classes can help alleviate those problems. Or I don't know, just training the teachers to not be so biased. And then more screening should be done regarding IQ and aptitude levels of young kids. The way that Benet did it, in a way to help them and say, hey, you're falling behind, let's help you, let's intervene so that your IQ can go back up. And then, recent summary reviewed literature of what kind of programs work best for reducing the long-term impact of some of those physiological risk factors for criminality. And some of this was like, if someone has a head trauma, take it very seriously. Look for at-risk children that may have gone through some of these kind of medical issues. And then mandatory health insurance for pregnant mothers and children, which would be really effective. That's a huge one. Like, just give people health insurance so that they can get the prenatal care they need so that their babies don't have, problems. And that also so that they can get any sort of the, health care that they need during that time of being pregnant and during that time of when children are young and developing. This is probably the most efficient way to reduce crime in the long term in that sense would be universal health care. Hello. And then all youths, the last one I think very, very, very true. All youth should be screened for abnormal levels of hormones, neurotransmitters, and especially toxins like lead. We know that a lot of water systems around the country are failing, like the Flint, Michigan kind of model. And, a lot of children, especially poor children of color, are exposed to a lot of contaminants in their local environments and in their water systems. And things like lead are dangerous, heavy chemicals heavy metals that never leave your body and can cause all sorts of developmental problems. So screening for that and actually providing safe water and communities for all children would be a great way to also reduce future crime.